So I want you to imagine a building that's, well, designed to be an absolute fortress, like iron bars are welded to the windows.
Right.
Heavy reinforced doors are securing all the corridors.
Yeah.
And, high walls surround the entire perimeter.
Just standard high security setup.
Exactly. The entire architectural philosophy is based on keeping external threats out. But imagine a fire breaks out on the inside of that exact same fortress.
Wow. Yeah.
How do you get out?
I mean, you don't. It creates a terrifying structural trap, really. You are essentially sealed inside a highly combustible environment, and the very mechanisms that were meant to protect you are now, blocking your egress.
And that structural trap is exactly what is at the center of the deep dive we're getting into today.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. We're looking at a pretty concise but incredibly dense report from the Associated Press. It details a devastating fire at the Utumishi girls' school in central Kenya.
Yeah, this happened on a Thursday night in a town called Gilgil, right?
Yes, exactly. And our mission today isn't just to, read you the headlines.
No, we need to go deeper than that.
Right. We are going to deconstruct the timeline of this evacuation, analyze the very unique demographic of this specific student body, and really break down the logistics of a massive multi-agency medical response.
And ultimately, we need to examine the glaring architectural failures that turn these specific types of institutions into, well, potential hazards.
Because, when we analyze a mass casualty event like this, stopping at just the raw numbers doesn't give us the full picture at all.
Not even close.
No.
By breaking down the specific mechanics of the response and the forensic realities of the aftermath, we can start to see a very clear, troubling pattern.
A pattern regarding institutional infrastructure in East Africa, right?
Yeah, exactly, which the source material really highlights.
So I want you, the listener, to really put yourself at the perimeter of that 800-student boarding school campus. The government confirmed 16 students were killed.
Just an unimaginable loss.
And 79 others were injured. Now, looking at those numbers, my initial hypothesis was that maybe the fire spread slowly enough for most people to wake up and run.
Right, like they got out but were hurt.
Yeah, like perhaps they were overcome by smoke inhalation on their way out. Is that what drives a ratio of 79 injuries to 16 fatalities?
I mean, smoke inhalation is always a major factor in these events. But to understand that specific ratio in a densely populated dormitory, we really have to look at the physics of crowd dynamics.
Crowd dynamics, like how people move.
Yeah. When you have hundreds of people waking up in the dark to alarms and intense heat, a controlled environment doesn't just get messy. It fundamentally shifts how human bodies move.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, we often think of an evacuation as, people running down a hallway.
Yeah.
But in a panic, a crowd of that size stops moving like individual people.
Right.
And it actually starts behaving governed by fluid dynamics.
Oh, wow. So like trying to force a massive volume of water through a tiny funnel?
Precisely. That's exactly it. The pressure builds at the bottleneck, which in a dormitory is usually a single narrow exit door.
Because the other doors are locked for security.
Yes. So the flow of movement completely stops, and the physics of the panic actually trap people. The injuries in these scenarios are rarely just from thermal burns.
Wait, really? What else is causing them?
Well, the 79 injured students were likely suffering from crush injuries. When that bottleneck forms, the force of hundreds of people pushing from behind creates what is known as compressive asphyxia.
Compressive asphyxia. So they literally can't breathe because of the pressure.
Exactly. People simply cannot expand their lungs to breathe because of the physical pressure of the crowd packed around them.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Combine that with individuals tripping in the dark, and the frantic mass exit becomes a secondary hazard that is just as lethal as the fire itself.
So the architecture of the building, funneling 800 students to limited exits, basically weaponizes their own panic against them.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Which takes us to a critical detail about who exactly was caught in that bottleneck. Because Utumishi isn't just a standard public school, is it?
No, it's not. And this is a very unique layer to this tragedy.
Right. The AP report notes it is a government-owned secondary school, but it's managed and sponsored by the Kenya Police Service.
Right. Which means many of the students living in those dorms are actually the daughters of police officers.
And those exact same police officers were the ones leading the rescue efforts on the ground.
Yeah, which completely alters the operational reality of the emergency response.
See, when I saw that detail, I immediately questioned the chain of command there. Because if I am a local officer and I get a radio call that my daughter's dorm is burning...
You're not thinking about protocol.
Exactly. I am abandoning every standard operating procedure to get to her. Does a localized, highly personal connection like that actually hinder the logistics of a coordinated emergency response?
It does. It introduces a massive operational vulnerability, actually. Standard emergency response relies heavily on a triage system.
Right, sorting the victims.
Yeah, often it's an algorithm called START, which stands for Simple Triage and Rapid Treatment.
Okay.
First responders are trained to maintain professional detachment so they can objectively sort victims based on the severity of their injuries and, well, their likelihood of survival.
So it's very clinical, very cold.
It has to be. It requires stepping onto a scene and making calculated decisions, sometimes bypassing someone who is too severely injured to focus on someone who can still be saved.
But, I mean, a parent pulling kids from a burning building isn't going to follow an algorithm.
Not a chance.
They are going to hyper-focus on finding their specific child or, the children of their colleagues.
And that is exactly the problem. That hypermotivation guarantees that they will work until they literally drop from exhaustion. But it obliterates objective scene management.
Right, because a father cannot objectively triage his own daughter.
No. And this dual role creates an immense psychological burden on the Kenya Police Service. Plus, it severely complicates the subsequent investigation.
Oh, because they're investigating themselves.
Right. The agency responsible for managing the facility is simultaneously tasked with investigating its own potential negligence, all while processing the trauma of their own families.
Which is just an impossible situation. And that makes the logistics of the wider response even more critical, because the local police couldn't handle this in a vacuum.
Right. They needed backup. A lot of it.
Yeah, the AP report outlines a massive multi-agency effort because Gilgil is roughly, 120 kilometers away from the capital, Nairobi?
About that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty rural.
So the Kenya Red Cross was actively evacuating students to various hospitals. But the detail that really stood out to me was the deployment of a Kenyan Air Force aircraft to airlift at least one victim to St. Joseph Hospital.
That's a very significant detail, yes.
When I first read that, I assumed the military was called in simply because, rural roads at night were too slow or maybe impassable for standard ambulances.
That's a common assumption, but it's usually more than just traffic.
Right. So is there a clinical reason why standard transport wouldn't work? Are ambulances not equipped for this specific type of trauma?
It is entirely clinical.
Yeah.
Severe fire trauma is, frankly, one of the most complex medical emergencies the human body can endure.
Okay, how so?
Well, an airlift isn't just about cutting down travel time. It is about moving an intensive care environment through the sky. A regional clinic in a town like Gilgil is equipped for routine emergencies.
Like broken bones or minor accidents?
Exactly. They cannot handle a sudden influx of high-degree burns.
Because severe burns require more than just, bandages and pain meds.
Oh, much more. When a patient suffers third-degree burns over a large percentage of their body, they lose their skin's ability to retain moisture.
Oh, right, because the skin is a barrier.
Yeah. And that loss leads to catastrophic, rapid fluid loss and hypovolemic shock. They require massive, carefully calculated intravenous fluid resuscitation.
Wow, so you need specialized gear just to keep their fluid levels up.
And that's just the surface. Furthermore, if they inhaled superheated air, their airway will begin to swell shut within minutes.
So they can't breathe at all.
Right. Which requires specialized intubation or emergency surgical airways. A rural clinic just doesn't have the ventilators, the specialized burn beds, or the sterile environments required to prevent immediate lethal infections.
So putting them in an ambulance would have been a disaster.
Yeah, the commanders on the ground called the Air Force because putting a critically burned student in the back of a standard ambulance for a 2-hour drive to Nairobi would have been a death sentence.
That is just sobering. So while the military is coordinating this high-stakes medevac in the air, there is a completely different, equally intense situation unfolding back at the school gates.
The parents?
Yes. Dozens of parents rushed to the campus, and the report notes that the victims remained unidentified, and this lack of information was fueling immense anger and frustration among the families.
It's a completely understandable reaction.
Absolutely. If I try to put myself in the position of those parents, standing at the gate, hearing sirens and seeing smoke, the silence from the authorities would look like a cover-up.
It feels intentional to them, even when it's not.
Right. Why does the identification process move so slowly in these specific disasters? Like, why can't the authorities just set up a triage tent and let parents visually identify their children?
As agonizing as it is, the frustration stems from a misunderstanding of forensic reality. Fire fundamentally changes the nature of victim identification.
In what way?
In other mass casualty events, visual identification by a family member is standard protocol. But intense thermal events destroy the primary visual markers we rely on.
Like clothing and hair.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Clothing, hair, skin pigmentation, and facial features are completely compromised. The physical destruction removes the ability to simply look and know.
Oh, man. That is so dark.
It is. And relying on visual identification in a severe fire is incredibly dangerous from a procedural standpoint.
Because someone might make a mistake in their grief.
Exactly. The trauma of the event can cause families to misidentify victims. And the absolute worst thing an agency can do is tell a parent their child has perished, only to find them alive in a hospital ward.
Or conversely, to release the wrong remains to a family?
Precisely. Therefore, authorities are forced to rely on scientific forensic odontology or DNA analysis.
Which requires comparing medical records to physical remains.
Correct. When soft tissue is compromised, investigators look to the hardest substance in the human body, which is dental enamel.
Because teeth survive the fire.
Right. Enamel can survive temperatures that completely incinerate bone. But analyzing dental records or extracting viable DNA from heat-degraded tissue takes days or even weeks.
It's a whole laboratory process.
Exactly. So while the authorities are adhering to necessary scientific protocols to ensure accuracy, the parents at the gate experience that delay as bureaucratic stalling.
And that vacuum of information instantly breeds suspicion and anger.
It always does. It's human nature.
And, you know, for the parents who do receive information, the reality is still incredibly grim. The source mentions a mother, Elizabeth Rioba, who was relieved to find her 2 daughters alive.
But deeply saddened for the others.
Yes. But then Rioba shares this haunting detail. One of her daughters was severely traumatized because she actually watched her friend get stuck while trying to jump out of a window to escape the flames.
That is just horrific.
I mean, we talked about the physical crush of the bottleneck earlier, but witnessing something like that introduces an entirely different mechanism of injury.
It does. It introduces profound psychological trauma. Specifically, survivor's guilt.
Survivor's guilt, yeah.
The students who made it out didn't just escape a fire. They navigated a landscape of horror where their peers did not. Witnessing a friend become physically trapped while you continue moving forward. It triggers an aggressive form of counterfactual thinking.
Counterfactual thinking, like playing the what-if game.
Exactly. The brain is endlessly looping the scenario, asking, why did I choose the door while she chose the window? Or could I have pulled her out?
So the human brain tries to find logic in a completely illogical, chaotic event.
Right. That student will carry the psychological burden of her survival, constantly questioning if she could have done something differently.
While the physical burns will eventually scar over, this specific type of invisible trauma alters the psychological baseline of the entire student body.
Indefinitely. The school is no longer a sanctuary of learning. It is the site where their friends perished.
Which forces us to look at how the institutions respond to that trauma. Because when the initial grief settles, the focus always shifts to accountability.
Right, the investigation phase.
Yeah. The AP report states the exact cause of the fire hadn't been established yet, but Education Minister Julius Ogamba announced an investigation to determine if the school's quote-unquote fire safety manual was adhered to.
Right, looking for procedural failures.
But then the report explicitly notes that this incident marks a grim addition to a history of school fires that have plagued the East African nation.
That's a very telling sentence from the AP.
Right. If the source clearly states this is a historical pattern, focusing on a safety manual feels like trying to put out a forest fire with a clipboard.
It really does.
What does checking a manual actually accomplish if a student is literally getting stuck in a window?
It accomplishes very little, because it addresses procedural theory rather than architectural reality.
Exactly.
This brings us back to a concept we touched on at the very beginning of our analysis.
Yeah.
The security versus safety paradox.
Right, keeping threats out versus keeping kids safe inside.
Yes. When the education minister focuses on a manual, he is looking for a procedural failure. Like, did they hold a fire drill where the extinguishers expired?
But the detail about the student getting stuck in the window points to a massive structural failure.
Precisely.
Why would a school window trap a student in the first place? Like, why are they built like that?
Because in many under-resourced or high-crime regions, boarding schools have to prioritize perimeter security over internal safety.
To protect the students from outside threats like theft or unauthorized entry.
Exactly. So they fortify the buildings, They install heavy steel grills or they weld iron bars across the dormitory windows. They put heavy padlocks on the primary exit doors at night.
So the architectural modifications designed to protect them from external human threats become the exact mechanisms that seal their fate during an internal environmental threat.
That is the security versus safety paradox in a nutshell. You cannot execute a rapid evacuation through a barred window, no matter what the fire safety manual dictates.
Right, a written procedure cannot override welded steel.
Exactly. So when the AP report categorizes this as the latest incident to afflict the nation, it is highlighting a systemic infrastructural crisis.
Not just a one-off accident.
No. Investigating whether a manual was followed allows the government to point the finger at local administrators for procedural lapses, rather than addressing the fact that the state is housing students in highly combustible, modified fortresses.
With completely inadequate egress routes.
Yes. It shifts the blame.
It completely reframes the tragedy. It isn't just about a spark in the dark. It is about an environment engineered in a way that makes survival nearly impossible once that spark catches.
It's a profoundly structural issue.
Let's pull all these threads together, because we started with the raw facts of the Utumishi girls' school fire. 16 dead, 79 injured, in a facility of over 800 students.
A massive human toll.
And we broke down how the physics of crowd dynamics turned a narrow exit into a lethal bottleneck.
Right, the compressive asphyxia.
Yeah. And then we examined the severe logistical and psychological complications of having a police-sponsored school rescued and investigated by the very officers whose families were inside.
The collapse of objective triage.
Exactly. Then we looked at the critical necessity of military medevacs for severe burn trauma and the agonizing slow science of forensic identification that leaves parents waiting in the dark.
Which breeds so much distrust.
And finally, we traced all of those immediate localized horrors back to the broader systemic issue.
An architectural paradigm that prioritizes securing a perimeter over ensuring the basic human right of safe egress.
Yes. When you look at the buildings you inhabit every day, your office, your apartment, your child's school, we rarely think about the structural choices that govern our safety until they fail.
We just take it for granted.
We assume the institutions that build these structures have prioritized our ability to escape. But this report forces us to confront what happens when that assumption is just fundamentally wrong.
It reveals a terrifying vulnerability in how we design educational spaces globally, really.
We tend to believe that stricter building codes and government mandates are the ultimate solution to these tragedies. But if centralized government infrastructure repeatedly prioritizes fortress-like security over rapid evacuation.
And we see it resulting in a historical pattern of mass casualties.
Right. We have to look beyond the blueprints. Perhaps the underlying issue isn't just about building safer fortresses.
So what's the alternative?
Well, it forces us to ask if the centralized, high-density boarding school model itself, especially when placed in regions struggling with emergency response infrastructure, is fundamentally incompatible with true student safety.
That's a huge question.
It is. If the state cannot build a facility that allows its students to safely flee a fire, how will communities evolve their own decentralized networks to protect their children when the institutions inevitably fail them again?
Wow. That is the structural reality that demands our attention far beyond the initial headlines.
It certainly is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.